A well-built ship can last a lot longer than your average car, train, or plane, but it can't last forever. When the time eventually comes for ships to end their days of sailing the oceans, most of them are brought somewhere to be taken apart and scrapped, so any materials of value can be recycled. Not all of them make it that far, though. Some of them end up being abandoned in unlikely places, and the stories of their abandonment are just as unlikely. The Kodiak wreck in Scotland is an unusual one because Kodiak isn't the name of the ship that's trapped here. The ship is actually called the MV Dayspring. The wreck is so named because the vessel is stranded close to Kodiak Sea Lock in Fort William. She's a fishing boat and spent most of her life catching mackerel and herring after she was launched in 1975. The fishing company she was connected to experienced financial difficulties in the year 2000, so she was temporarily moored up. That temporary mooring turned into 11 years of inactivity. The Dayspring became forgotten, but she was suddenly remembered again when a storm tore through the area in December 2011 and ripped her from her moorings, depositing her further up the coast. Nobody knew what to do with her after the storm settled, so she was forgotten again until, unbelievably, her still functional distress beacon went off in 2017 and triggered a response from the emergency services. Nobody knows why the beacon suddenly went off after 17 years. Maybe it's the Dayspring's way of asking for help. The wreck has become popular with photographers, but there's still no long-term plan about what to do with it. The Dimitrios, shipwrecked on the shore of the Greek town of Githio, is thought of as one of the world's most glamorous. We think that probably has more to do with the paradise location than the rusty old ship. 2021 marks 40 years as a wreck for this old freight ship, which hasn't moved since December 1981. Nobody knows how it ended up being wrecked here, but then nobody knows what it was doing before it was wrecked either. The 200-foot-long vessel was built in 1950, but beyond that, most of its history is unrecorded. The lack of information leads many people to believe that it was involved in criminal activities, most likely smuggling and narcotics. The most fanciful story that locals like to tell about it is that port authorities captured the Dimitrios in 1981, but were forced to cover up something about its operations, so they started a fire on board and then set it adrift. There's no evidence to support the tale other than the fact that the ship has definitely seen a fire at some point in the past. Still, a criminal history would explain why nobody ever came forward to claim her after she was wrecked. Gardar B64 is Iceland's oldest steel ship. That's the sort of fact that ought to earn the vessel a place in a ship museum, but sadly it hasn't been afforded that kind of respect. It's been stuck on a beach for a very long time, and it's slowly falling to pieces. This vessel was launched in 1912, the same year the Titanic sank. Back then, it was called the Globe 4 and was considered to be a state-of-the-art whaling ship. It had a reinforced hull for breaking through sea ice and a steam engine to keep it moving when the wind dropped. The ship survived both World Wars and even survived the restrictions that were eventually placed on the whaling industry. She was repurposed as a fishing vessel for catching herring in 1963, which is also when she acquired her current name. She was 51 years old by then but managed to keep sailing until 1981, when she was finally declared unfit for service and deliberately run aground in Scapadallar Valley. She's still there today, and, with a little money and restoration work, looks like she could still sail. Sometimes it's what you don't know about a shipwreck that makes it more interesting than what you do know. Take this Australian wreck as an example. It's stuck within the mangroves at Blind Bight, Victoria. Nobody seems to know how it got there, where it came from, or who it belonged to. The wreck has recently become popular with drone photographers. That, in turn, has led to new efforts to identify the wreck. Experts in the field have been able to say that it's likely a 19th century vessel based on its design, but beyond that, there isn't enough of it left to identify it. Part of what makes it so remarkable is that it looks like it's been there so long that the mangroves have grown around it, as if someone planted them specifically to hide the ship. You can be stood on the shore at Blind Bight looking in the direction of the shipwreck, and you'd see nothing because of the mini forest that blocks your view. It's almost as if the ship came looking for some privacy so it could rot away in peace. Speaking of ships that are hard to identify by looking at them, check out this broken old hulk in Anacortes, Washington, USA. It's been left here for so long that it's developed its own ecosystem. Unlike the Australian wreck, though, we know what ship this is. It's an old schooner called La Merced, and it was built to carry petroleum products for Standard Oil in 1917. It seems she had a completely unremarkable service history, eventually ending up in the hands of a company that used her as a cannery in Alaska. By 1966, she was unfit even for that limited purpose, and so she was scuttled here in Anacortes. That's well over 50 years ago, which explains why she's in such a sorry state today. There was never a plan to plant trees on her broken back and turn her into a strange, self-contained forest. Nature did that all on its own. Like many large old shipwrecks, she's become a popular attraction for photo shoots in the age of Instagram. But someone must have considered her to be important long before that, because she's been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1990. Our next stop is Cemeterio de Navios in Panguila, Angola, and if you think the word cemeterio might mean cemetery, you're right! The full name of the location translates into English as the Cemetery of Ships, which is a fair summary of what you'll find here. There are about 50 wrecked ships here in various states of decay, giving the beach a post-apocalyptic feel. Oddly, not even the locals know how or why this came to be a ship graveyard. It's possible that this was a drop-off point for freighters prior to the opening of the port of Luanda in 2002. But if that was the case, the drop-offs were never performed in an official capacity. Older residents claim that there were wrecks here long before 2002, and that the first of them appeared during the 1960s. Looking at the state of the most battered of the wrecks, that sounds more likely. One thing we can say for sure is that this many ships didn't end up here by accident, so there must have been a deliberate and communal act of dumping at some point in the past. Given the lack of clear information, criminal activity can't be ruled out as a cause. The Pasuta Shipwreck doesn't look real. The combination of the broken-down wooden wreck and the utterly unique backdrop makes it look like something that was designed in a video game. We can assure you it's very much real though, and you'll find it on Graham Island in British Columbia, Canada. The dreamy backdrop is provided by the unique scenery and rainforests of the Haida Gwaii archipelago, a largely unspoiled place that very few people have even heard of, let alone visited. The wreck of the Pasuta has been on the beach here since 1928, when the 264-foot-long log barge ran aground during a storm while making its way down to Lal River. She was already old by that point, having begun life as a steamship before being converted for logging just after the turn of the century. Today it looks like there's almost nothing left of her when you survey the wreck from a distance, but get closer and you'll see that the metal portholes are still in place, and at least part of the ship is buried beneath the sand. The parts of the Pasuta above the sand will eventually disappear completely, but hopefully not for another few decades. Moving down from Canada to the United States of America, we find the wreck of the Peter Iredale, stranded in the coastal city of Warrenton. Like the Pasuta, there isn't much of it left, but that's less surprising in the case of the Peter Iredale. It's been here for well over a century after running aground in October 1906 while on its way to the Columbia River. Various plans were discussed to salvage or otherwise remove the boat at the time it became stuck, but none of them ever came to fruition. The people of the time just assumed that nature would eventually do the job for them. They were probably right, but it's going to take longer than any of them imagined. Photos taken close to the time of the wreck suggest that it was badly damaged upon impact, with the rear half of the vessel almost completely torn away. Unfortunately, history doesn't record much more about the ship than its fate. Still, that doesn't put off the many visitors who come here every year to take pictures. When the tide is low, you can even walk right up to it and touch it, although it's recommended that you don't try to get inside. You would expect most shipwrecks that are a century old or more to have rotted away, but that isn't always the case. The ones that stay underwater tend to enjoy a better state of preservation. The wreck of the Sweepstakes is the perfect example of that. This old schooner is currently in Big Tub Harbor in the Georgian Bay of Lake Huron, USA, where it's been since it hit a rock close to Cove Island in August 1885. A rescue team towed her to the harbor 11 days after the collision in an attempt to save her, but she couldn't be rescued. Today, she's submerged in just 36 feet of water and visible from the surface on a clear day. The hull is almost completely intact even after all these years, and 2 mooring buoys help to ensure that she stays that way. She's easily the best preserved of all the 19th century schooners that once sailed the Great Lakes. The tours that the schooners used to offer have long since fallen out of fashion, but in modern times the Sweepstakes has become a tourist attraction in her own right. Families take trips out to see her in glass-bottomed boats, allowing incredible views of the wreck from directly above it. Shipwrecks don't come much weirder than the wreck of the Kodiak Queen in the British Virgin Islands. The rusty old warship can be seen from a great distance, as can the enormous kraken that appears to have it in its grip. The kraken obviously isn't real, so what's the story here? We should start with the Second World War, during which the Kodiak Queen was a military fuel barge called the YO-44 and was one of only 5 ships that survived Pearl Harbor. She became a fishing trawler after the war and served for many years before eventually finding her way to the British Virgin Islands to be scrapped. That's where she caught the eye of billionaire Richard Branson. He decided he was going to turn it into both an artificial reef and an art exhibition, with the 80-foot-long kraken added as a hook for tourists. That was in 2017. Unfortunately, that year saw some of the biggest swells that have ever occurred in the region. No sooner was the work completed than the ship was tossed 30 feet by a swell, and the kraken sculpture was damaged. Branson could have paid to have it repaired, but never did, and so now the Kodiak Queen exists in a state of limbo. The Mary Rose is one of the most famous British ships of all time. It was the flagship of Henry VIII's fleet. That tells you a lot about how old it is, because Henry VIII died in 1547. She looks amazing for a ship of her age, and all the more amazing when you consider that she spent most of the past 500 years underwater. After being assembled in 1510, the Mary Rose was the pride of the King's fleet, until she was lost in a battle with the French close to Portsmouth Harbor in 1545. That's where she stayed, until she was raised in 1982. That was just the start of trying to preserve her, though. For the next several years, the vessel was sprayed with water and wax regularly as a capsule-shaped museum was literally built around her. Finally, in 2013, she was ready to be visited by the British public. She's fully dried out, doesn't require spraying with preservatives anymore, and should last for another 500 years. Many of the artifacts that were found on the ship when it was raised are now positioned around it in the museum, offering a unique insight into life in the Navy during England's Tudor period. We have one more shipwreck to look at, and it's the SS Mojino. She was a hospital ship during the First World War, but today she's stuck on the coast of Fraser Island in Australia. She's badly rusted and full of holes, but somehow the bulk of her hull is still in one piece. Life as a hospital ship isn't exactly what the designers of the Mojino had in mind when she was built. She was supposed to be a luxury ocean liner, ferrying wealthy customers on sightseeing trips across the Tasman Sea. When the First World War broke out, though, the 5,000-ton vessel was called into active service. She even made it as far as the UK, carrying wounded soldiers from France back to England. After the war, she went back to Australia and returned to her original line of work before she was bought by an Osaka-based shipbreaker in July 1935. However, she never made it to Japan. While being towed there, she was struck by a cyclone, which tore her tow line and set her adrift. It was sheer luck that she and the 8 people aboard her ended up beached on Fraser Island rather than becoming lost at sea. Today, the wreck is extremely fragile, and so is off-limits to visitors. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!